Well, welcome back, everyone. So this session is entitled Building a Network of Laboratories for Serosurveillance Across Canada. We have with us 5 excellent panelists that within the next hour will explain to us how to do that. So no pressure here. So we have with us Ina Sekirov, who we met yesterday and this morning, is a microbiologist in the Public Health Laboratory at the BC Centre for Disease Control and the program head for the Tuberculosis Mycobacteriology Laboratory. We have Laurie Beach, who is also on this morning's panel, is a clinical biochemist and head of chemistry at IWK Health in Halifax, Nova Scotia. We have Derek Stein, who we also heard from this morning, is a scientist working at the Chatham Provincial Laboratory in Manitoba. Online, we have Carmen Charlton, once again, who we met this morning, is a clinical microbiologist at the Alberta Public Health Laboratory. And new to the stage, Amanda Lang, is a clinical microbiologist at the Saskatchewan Health Authority, an assistant professor and clinical microbiologist in the Department of Pathology and Laboratory Medicine at the University of Saskatchewan. Her research interests include infectious disease, diagnostics, with a focus on serology and viral STBBIs, molecular tests for viral respiratory infections, and STBBIs, diagnostic tests for zoonoses, and surveillance of viral STBBIs, respiratory viruses, and zoonoses. Oh, that's a repeat there. All right. And I'm Marc-André Langlois. I'm a molecular virologist. I study host-encoded restriction factors for viruses and humoral antibody responses to viral infection. I'm still wondering why I was invited to moderate this session, but I suspect it's because that during the pandemic, I established a high-throughput facility. And in collaboration with my colleague, Anne-Claude Gingras, at the Lunenfeld Tannenbaum Research Institute in Toronto, we developed a highly harmonized serological assay that could basically analyze data from each of our labs, and we would have a highly harmonized output for those samples. Together, to this day, we analyzed over 3 million samples, or performed 3 million ELISAs. My laboratory alone, I heard we reached the 1.6 million mark last week. And I haven't asked Anne-Claude for an update, but we are well over 3 million ELISAs. Serosurveillance starts in the lab. This is what I believe. The lab will dictate the types of assays we can perform, the number of assays we can perform, the quality of the assays, and also the richness of the data that we can extract from that. So luckily, the lab component of serosurveillance is extremely easy, so I am told. But even for an assay as simple as an ELISA, one has to understand there's extreme variability between laboratories. The different laboratories will use different reagents, different tips, different plates, antigens from different sources, antigens that look quite different. And this renders a very complex ecosystem to be able to report that data and to harmonize the data. And then to that, we have to add the complexities of the samples themselves. Samples of serum, dried blood spot, plasma EDTA, plasma sodium citrate, controls that are different. Some use in-house controls or international standards. Even the month of the year when you perform the analysis will impact your results, surprisingly. If you perform your ELISAs in November or in spring, we've seen variability. The humidity is different, the quality of the water. So all of this has to be accounted for by modelers. And who is modeling the data? Who is analyzing the data? There are differences across laboratories that render this complex. The REB associated with the samples also alters the type of data that can be extracted in the end from the analyses. And then there's the procurement, something as simple as procurement. We don't talk enough about procurement. In September 2020, when we received notice that our proposal was funded and we were purchasing high-throughput samplers, this was for a study that was funded by CIHR and CITF. Hamilton notified us that we had 4 days to give them the PO for those instruments because the US was restricting the export of robotic liquid handlers. So the University of Ottawa pulled off a miracle. Within 4 days, they managed to generate the PO. Hamilton put those robots on the truck and we received them in time. But there's a caveat to that. We were not fast enough to secure the tips. So the conductive tips required for these assays, we could not source them from the US. The restriction was in place. Luckily, Hamilton sourced the tips from Germany and airlifted 6 full-size pallets of tips at no cost so that we could do our assays. So procurement in what we call interpandemic stages or times, we don't like to use peacetime, or in pandemic is very different. And this is something that we have to bear in mind when we are building a network of laboratories for serosurveillance. So enough said, I'm going to hand over the stage to our panelists who will share their thoughts for a few minutes. So perhaps start at the end. Ina?
Thank you. Well, we did orient ourselves west to east. I guess Carmen is going to have to go next, though. I think for starters, I have to say that, this here right now is a great network, of multiple people, including labs. And, I think maintaining this kind of an engagement, with our lab colleagues as well as, across the board is really going to be crucial. And then with respect to the lab specifically, I have the provincial lab lens. And, one thing that I think would be really important is to make sure that serology is well represented among CPHLN. I think I mentioned in the first day that we are hoping to engage CPHLN and to establish a serology-specific working group, and for all of the provincial laboratories to be able to come together as part of that, and have conversations on serology as part of serosurveillance as well as other uses of serology. But in addition to the provincial lab engagement, we also need to make sure that we have good engagement with our frontline hospital and outpatient laboratories because, they are also a rich source of residual samples. Some, kind of samples that sometimes are underrepresented in the provincial labs for specialized patient populations across the age range, etc. And as part of that, with our frontline lab colleagues as well as provincial lab colleagues, I think we need to make sure that it's not only the clinical scientific staff who are interested and engaged and involved with serological studies, but that we also have buy-in from our operational counterparts. And, with operational interest, there is also that additional lever that can be pressed to advocate for funding. There is the hopefully goodwill towards actually continuing providing the residual samples and, engaging with surveillance efforts. And we touched on this a little bit as well in the earlier morning session, but I think educational programs would be really quite important to be able to ensure that there is ongoing expertise, again, at both the technical level as well as scientific level. And, perhaps we can look at creating some sort of sub-courses as part of training programs or standalone, etc. But, I think having this educational component will draw people in and hopefully, facilitate their long-term engagement.
Well, thank you. We'll go from West Coast to East Coast. I like that idea. So I'm going to give the
we'll
microphone
jump to
to
Alberta then. Okay. Well, I have to agree with Ina, I think that there was, so CPHLN, or the Canadian Public Health Laboratory Network, is a well-established public health network that meets on at least a monthly basis, and definitely in the pandemic met more frequently. And I think things like the CTIF Serology Working Group that came out of CTIF during the pandemic was really valuable to allow the labs across the country to try to start to standardize. One of the things that I think, so maybe I should give a little bit of context. Alberta's a little bit different because our public health lab basically has all of our acute care. We're considered one lab for the entire province. We're on one LIS, even though there are some sites that have not quite merged over to the LIS. I would say the majority of all of our labs are on the LIS. So we deal with the clinical samples, the daily specimens, as well as public health. And so it's kind of the lines between public health and acute care are a little bit more gray than maybe they are in some of the other provinces. And so when we start to look at a lot of our studies, like our residual study, we were kind of able to mobilize within the province to get our residual samples because they're all under this one lab banner. So, you know, a tiny lab in Lethbridge is going to be still managed by the same people who oversee in general in the province. So it's a little bit different there. But once you start looking at outside of the province, and trying to collaborate on more of a national level, I think those working groups are really key because your ability to have standards, and maybe this is something that we can kind of consider for the next pathogen X or pandemic that we see, is to rapidly develop a set of either titrated or known standards so that all labs can do an immediate comparison. Because we have different instruments than Saskatchewan does, or Manitoba, or BC. And even though they're commercial assays, especially at the beginning, it's not like we had an international standard. And so trying to make those equal across to see if, you know, the Roche assay was the same as the Abbott platform. And that was really challenging at the beginning. So if we would have started with, here is our standard and let's do a titration, and this is what our equivalent units were, I think that would have made a lot of ease in how we interpreted the samples later on. So I think there's some things that we could have done better, but I do think that those national networks really helped streamline a lot of the problems that we saw.
All right, thank you, Carmen. Next, Amanda.
Hello. Yeah, it's kind of hard to follow Ina and Carmen there because they've just echoed everything I was thinking and wrote down to talk about. But I have, I guess, a couple further thoughts. You know, I truly echo CPHLN and its usefulness and in sharing both, you know, data and samples. I'll echo once again how onerous MTAs and whatnot are. For the most part within the CPHLN, we were fairly freely sharing, but you know, there were a few instances where it was tough to get samples from certain provinces because they had a more stringent process for even sending documents. Something that's been extremely successful, I'll maybe throw FAC under the bus now that they've left, is... okay, sorry. My apologies. My apologies, but I'm still going to talk about this. So something that's been extremely successful, I think, is like the LLTO and the Gelato programs that link the provincial labs with the National Micro Lab and with FAC, and the Gelato program being for genomics, whole genome sequencing of SARS-CoV-2, and that has started to branch into other respiratory viruses and respiratory pathogens. And for Saskatchewan, that's been instrumental in our ability to maintain sequencing capacity because our clinical staff, most of the time we need to divert them to actual clinical work. We do have a typing and surveillance department, but we can't maintain staffing levels to keep that department open. And so when, there's no techs to hire, the first thing to get cut is surveillance. So having those staff on the ground to validate the sequencing assays, to actually perform it and help get data uploaded to GISAID and whatnot has been excellent. And so, maybe that's something we should leverage. Maybe there should be SLTOs, serology lab technical officers. That's, leverage a program that's already working extremely well and just expand. And then one more thing that's a little more to do with academia. I think we had very good partnerships within province clinical labs and within national provincial labs, but partnerships with academia were tough for us in Saskatchewan. I just had the Vaccine and VIDO, Vaccine Infectious Disease Organization, tried to get them a single mpox sample, and it's been held up in legal, but in a stalemate between the two legal teams for 3 months for a single sample. And they're on our doorstep. We should be sharing, we should be able to share, we should be able to have these, networks within province and everywhere to just share samples. And, we both want to, there's no reason we can't, but just something in the legal language. So, when we heard earlier about the 24-hour turnaround time for I threw my hands up and was like, how is that even possible? So, I don't know how we can make that a part of the network, but, teams to do that and make these templates for us that will work as blanket MTAs for the whole country would just really facilitate that sharing and that network.
Thank you. Derek, your thoughts?
They're not going to be selfish this time, so.
I don't have to call you out this time.
No, you don't have to call me out. I actually would like to circle back to some of your initial comments. It really triggered me when you talked about the Hamilton, and it's kind of interesting because we had significant challenges when it came to procurement, particularly given that CADM Provincial Lab was a government entity. And I don't think we would have gotten any of the serosurveillance done if I hadn't actually put the money at the university level in order to, pretty much everything that was purchased for the CITF projects that you guys funded for CADM was actually ran through the university. We went through a process where, we were in a similar boat. We wanted to get a hold of a Hamilton very early on in the pandemic. And our tendering process took 1.5 years. We finally got a Hamilton. In fact, we had the tips, but we didn't have the Hamilton.
I should have reached out to you.
Yes. So we should have been talking more because I still have tips at the lab that we never got to use, and that are about to expire actually. But you really triggered me there on that one. So I really feel like it's just one little small thing, but when you try to implement this stuff, it in the context of everything that everyone's been saying, it's really it becomes a real challenge to actually build a network. Carmen was mentioning the standardization of assays really early on in the pandemic. We had the CPLHLN serology working group, and honestly, that was my first. I started at CADM in end of February 2020. And it was from the NML and right into the fire. So and that working group was really my first introduction to CPLHN and how things were kind of implemented. And without that group, I don't think we would have gotten very far. We really early on did a huge validation and we're sharing data really quickly across some of these assays that were coming out. A lot of the assays weren't even Health Canada approved; they were just research use only or emergency use only. And so even without sharing samples, we were able to get some semblance of a standardized and validated assays across the provinces, so that we could start doing serosurveillance really early on. But yeah, I'll just leave it at that, and I'll pass it on to my colleague. I'm sure we'll have lots more to talk about in the next little while, but.
I'm really jealous when I hear that people were able to test millions of samples, because we struggled so much to test 1,500. I think as we build a network of laboratories, it will be really great to explore the differences and what's possible, where you do sometimes have areas where your clinical work is bleeding into the serology work, and you're really tapping the same people, you're tapping the same resources to try to get this done, which is kind of why you have a biochemist here, because our microbiologists were very busy on other things at the time. And when you do have that tight integration with the clinical lab, I think there can be an advantage to it, and then there could be a disadvantage to it as well. The advantage to it is that you're already at the point where you're ready for clinical use. Like you don't have two different assays, one that's approved and one that's not. And so you have something that's just ready to go clinically and at the level of the individual Canadian. But the challenge is also then where we have vendors that do not have standardized assays, and there's good competition around getting out the best assay. And then the conversation in the scientific and medical community of which one is the best assay, right? So there's healthy competition perhaps in that way as well. In our experience, for example, we had an assay at my hospital that we had brought up for multisystem inflammatory syndrome in children. And so that's what we were able to use. By the time the vaccines were out and we needed a nucleocapsid assay, we fortunately were able to go to our partnering hospital next door that had an Abbott system. And the challenge there, though, was that even though we had the samples pulled and ready, and the willingness to do the work and the funding to do the work for 1,000 samples, it was months before they could free up time, because there's regular clinical work that has to be prioritized for all of these things. And the situation right now is that, as vendors make appropriate fiscal decisions about whether or not they're going to maintain assays, given the market demand, in Nova Scotia right now, I do not have a way to measure any more COVID serology. So it's just not even a possibility right now. Yeah, so because Ortho withdrew their assays, we don't have a Roche platform to do it on, and the Abbott platform is busy with clinical work, right? So it would be challenging to bring up those assays for just serosurveillance at this point, which is why one of the opportunities that I'm hoping we can keep talking about, and I think it's funny that the introduction was, we're going to find out how we do it, and we all kind of went, good, we should just talk, is sort of the idea of, how can we regionalize some testing? In Atlantic Canada, I'm very interested in seeing how we can regionalize Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Newfoundland and Labrador to maybe one site, one location, but then to also have that opportunity to share experience. I love the idea of having a set of standards at the ready so that we can know in real time what's going on with our different assays. And then even to supply chain, a bit of a thing in left field about supply chain. One of the things that makes me a little bit nervous about standardization sometimes is if, for example, we did run into supply chain issues with a single vendor. And not having the capability to potentially quickly pivot to another opportunity. We certainly saw that when we had the global blood collection tube shortage, which we had to speak about in 2020. 2020 and 2021. So, and it was interesting, just side story, telling the public we have a national tube shortage. Please don't go get your hemoglobin A1C measured right now. If you have a requisition in your hot little hands, don't go do it. And what people did was they went to the labs to try to get it done before we ran out. And completely the opposite effect that we wanted. But yeah, just a few thoughts.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your input. So here on the panel, we have a wealth of experience. All of you have lived through the pandemic in the laboratory. You've struggled through it. You know what the challenges are on these multiple levels that we've all chimed in about. Now, take off your public health hat, laboratory public health hat, and put on the Hemonet hat. And let's try to imagine what a national network of laboratories for Hemonet would look like. A network that is focused on residual blood. How would you imagine all of us working together for the laboratory component, because this is the panel, it's the laboratory component. How would you imagine all of us working together? For instance, for a given test, whether it's serology for influenza, serology for RSV, serology for coronaviruses, should we centralize the efforts in just a few labs? Should all the labs have equal capacity to perform the serology? What do you think would work best?
We can go west to east again. So I think with respect to Hemonet lab network, I think the great benefit there would be to not be reliant on, like a single source of suppliers, because, like I do agree that there is definitely a danger in, like putting all of your eggs into the same basket. So I think with respect to like a more diverse lab network, it will be key to make sure that, like all of those standards we talked about, that is in place. In addition to that, I think we need to also work on shared protocols for quality assurance, shared protocols for just, like conducting your study and your program. Because, with that, even given the diversity of the different assays that people will be using, there is still going to be enough commonality to be able to more easily harmonize the results down the line. Yeah, so I would advocate to maintain diversity, and of course, not every single person, not every single city, needs to have a lab that's capable of, testing for any given number of serologies, but there should be several, multiples of them, within a country size of Canada. And sorry, I had something else I was going to say, and it's just completely escaping me right now. But before, maybe I'll remember that later, but I just wanted to add my little anecdote in terms of procurement. So we bought our Hamilton off of eBay. So, yeah, I can definitely feel your pains, and, and I think sometimes we do have to, be very, unorthodox in, where we go to actually get our equipment. Oh, and I do remember what I was going to say. So in terms of maintaining capacity for testing, so, and that is another thing, like not every single lab is going to be able to maintain capacity for testing for the same, like set of pathogens at any given time. But if it is a network, and if we do have enough mechanisms to share in place, share samples, share reagents, etc., then I think there is going to be, again, more contingency in place to actually be able to do that. And the key to remember about serosurveillance in my mind is that, while I think the quality assurance protocols and quality improvement systems need to be really quite similar to what they are for clinical care, but the assays themselves don't actually need to be Health Canada approved if they're utilized for serosurveillance versus diagnostics.
Anyone else want to comment on what do they think this network should look like?
Yeah, I mean, I can from a Saskatchewan perspective, and maybe just from my own background, one of my postdocs was doing work with CERN, and I think that's a pretty good model to model after, having multiple sites across Canada that are, saving those residual samples and then sending them onwards to certain, master labs that are doing the actual research. I know in Saskatchewan, we stood down our SARS-CoV-2 assays as well when they became no longer relevant clinically. So, and in the current climate of, again, no technologists to hire and staff shortages everywhere, I can't see us being able to stand them up again for a surveillance project. So having somewhere that we could just save samples and then send onwards, I think would be pretty helpful for us, also in terms of freezer space, because the samples that go through chemistry, normally they just get tossed after 3 days. There's no banking of those. So that's just my thought. Model after CERN.
Carmen, you're online, and we don't want to forget you. Do you have any thoughts you would like to share on how you imagine this network of labs under HEMANET? How would you envisage them to operate?
Well, I think it really needs to be province specific or territory specific. So maybe, for example, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, like Atlantic provinces, maybe they don't maintain the capacity to do serology testing, for example, for whatever pathogen it might be. We'll just say COVID because that's what we're talking about. But maybe BC or Ontario, as larger provinces, do maintain that capacity. But I do think that we have to have pre-populated MTAs for that specimen transfer. And whether we do this as an ongoing basis and form a HEMANET biobank that could be accessed for negative samples, because I know the prenatal samples were really important for having negatives, because we could go a year back in time and essentially guarantee that the specimens that we were grabbing from those biobanks were negatives. And then going forward, we had positives come everywhere. But to have no negatives from a biobank or a biorepository somewhere that has freezer space to do appropriate sampling from, underrepresented populations or just overall in the population that you could then go back to. Maybe these are anonymized samples. Maybe they have minimal demographic information that's attached to it. But to have access to those samples that then anyone in the network can use, I think would be really beneficial and would help with us immediately standardizing a panel that you could say, okay, BC, this is our panel. What did you get on your instrument? Okay, Saskatchewan, here's our panel. What did you get on your instrument? And you can compare now apples to apples because you're running the same samples. Having a biorepository like that would also allow you to pool samples so you don't have to worry about volume constraints. And maybe this is somewhere where something like a blood operator like Héma-Québec or Canadian Blood Services can help come in for samples or storage of some samples to kind of bring in a larger network of repositories that we don't have to fight to move samples around. During the pandemic, I can't tell you how many times I hit my head against the wall trying to give samples or send data or do something outside of Alberta. Alberta put up pretty severe walls in the pandemic and then didn't really want to share, which is super unfortunate because we could have done so much. And I really think that these MTAs have to be at a pretty high government level so that they are maintained because, for example, in Alberta, I don't know if you're following politics, but now our lab is redone again for the 4th time in 10 years. And none of those people who would have signed those agreements 10 years ago exist in lab because they've all been fired. So this has to be at a very high level, I think, for MTAs as an agreement across all of the provinces so that it's actually maintained, because something at what is now Alberta Precision Labs would be gone if you would have done this 10 years ago. But just that evergreening, that collaboration, that making those MTAs available so that you can immediately transfer specimens and data would be so nice.
Thank you, Carmen. Laurie, Derek, do you have thoughts on this first question?
Well, I would just reiterate what Carolyn has said. I really think the foundation of what, if HemeNet work, or HemeNet is what it would look like, the foundation needs to be those agreements. Nothing really happens unless those agreements are in place. And so I think that should be priority number one, really, is to get those agreements in place between the HemeNet work partners and as Carolyn mentioned, at a very high level. So whatever happens, those agreements are still there, so that the network can continue to function. But yeah.
I was thinking very similarly that so much of that answer depends on whether we can move samples around as we want to. If we can, then it gives you the opportunity to potentially do more centralization and more specialization potentially. You could have some sites that are more dedicated to your high throughput, closer to commercial assays, and they could focus on those. You could have some sites that are more focused on your multiplexing and, closer to new tests that are being developed. You could have a transition site. You could have a site that actually is moving it from, depending on what we're seeing in the population, that is maybe tasked with moving it from a lab, not even lab developed test yet, but a research use only test into something that we say, you know what, based on what we're seeing, we think we need to move this into something that's ready for clinic sooner than later. And it could be one of your translational sites. And then all of this, again, to find the appropriate ways to feed that data back up, and then to the translational piece of, how are we going to influence the biologics that are available and all of that. So yeah, I think my answer is it depends. But I think you could choose how you might want to regionalize. If we can move samples as freely as we want, then maybe it makes sense to regionalize things differently.
Most of you have, I thought you were, okay. Most of you have mentioned contracts for moving samples around. I did not want to lead right away into this question, but I feel that just emerged at the very top. There are, as you know, there is the question of how do we move samples around with an MTA? But of course, there's even the pricklier question, how do we move the data around? Now, in our personal experience between the Ottawa lab and the Toronto lab, we needed modelers, we needed biostats gurus to go over the data and to help the two laboratories harmonize the data. In these contracts, how will we try to delineate that this ability to share the information is an intrinsic part of our ability to work together?
I don't know if you have the right people to ask that.
Well, I just think that that's an obvious thing that we need to have in our contracts, right? Is we need to have, with these sample agreements, there also needs to be an agreement that there's at least a minimum amount of information or data that we're willing to share within the network or network partners. There's the data bank that CITF has set up already that is open, you can apply to. That's a really great model that I think we can continue doing. That's probably one of the best ways that I could think of to really set that up. But
So should the data be analyzed at each different lab, or should that be centralized within one entity of HemeNet?
well, just to give you an example, I had access to the vaccine records for all of our participants in our serosurveillance study. So I was able to actually delineate better than some of the other provinces who was actually getting natural infection and who was vaccinated. I had to do two separate analyses, one for CITF and then one for the province, because we had that extra set of data that we were really willing to share. I think that that's exactly it. You need to have at least a bare minimum that everyone is willing to share. And then if you if the provinces have their own priorities or interests, then they can go further with that data and do a different type of analysis. But there needs to be this bare minimum analysis that we can do as a whole and as a network, right?
I also think part of the question here is not just, how we move data and how do we agree on moving data, but, the question of A, data ownership, and B, sort of like analysis ownership. Like if you provided your data and someone else did analysis centrally, like where do you come in with respect to ownership of, part of this analysis? And I think those things need to be discussed and need to be built into the contracts. And, like if you all, are able to actually agree on how do we attribute authorship, how do we, even, like we talked about this over lunch as we were walking down to buy some bagels, with things like CHR applications and that sort of things. Right now, like unless you're the first author or the last author on the paper, like that paper does very little to, strengthen your CHR application. But, given that, we really move into the world where we need to be able to share large data sets, share large sample sets, these data sets, these sample sets, they will come from multiple entities. And, realistically, agencies such as CHR and other funders, they need to have more recognition for this joint work, for this teamwork. And, I think if we work among ourselves in terms of, authorship attribution, as well as with the funders to recognize those, canons that we come up with, I think that's going to really facilitate our ability to agree with each other on what we want to share. And then in terms of, moving the data with the samples or moving samples with the data, I think also the sort of like what's the primary entity being moved is really, sort of, that is also in the eye of the beholder, because I remember one time I was giving a talk and talking about the difficulty of obtaining metadata to accompany the samples. And then an epidemiologist talked after me and said, well, we call the samples the metadata. So to them, the primary identifiers, that was the data, but the samples was the metadata. So like really depending on which side you come from, you're going to have a very different view of that.
Okay. Next is a question about standards and standardization of the assays. There was a very high pressure on the serology labs to report their data in binding antibody units per mil, which was an international standard. To do so, one needed to order these standards from the NIBSC. That caused procurement problems. For us, it took 4 weeks to get those standards in. The volume was extremely small, and those standards have now moved on to another batch of the standards that may or may not perform equally well in our assays. So the question is, within a HEMAnet infrastructure, should we be thinking of creating our own standards and standardization across our laboratories? Should there be consideration to create pooled sera from each of our provinces, each of our laboratories, to create a national standard so that we are not reliant on such necessities of continuously trying to procure international standards?
I guess I'm a little plus minus on that. On one hand, having Canadian-specific, easy to procure and compare national data to would be great, but on the other hand, then you're no longer able to compare your data to the rest of the world. So I think there's still definitely a role for the global standards or the international unit type standards, but I don't think they have to be mutually exclusive. You can have both, something that's Canadian that we can stand up quickly and at least be able to standardize to each other, and then at a later date when, international standards are available, be able to use those.
And I think you can go one step further with that too, is that you could have a pooled Canadian specimen and then run that in a standard to whatever the international standard is. So then you've essentially standardized your entire Canadian population by getting one international standard rather than doing it at every single lab.
And then we don't have those procurement issues.
Correct.
Exactly.
And as long as we can demonstrate the continuity between standards and the continuity of the calibration, I mean, that's like metrology, which is not my, not exactly what I do full time, but something that we think about all the time is to kind of go, okay, like, what is my assay standardized back to? Like, what is it calibrated back to? And can I actually trace that calibration? It's actually a requirement now for accreditation purposes. Can I actually trace that back to a common international standard, for example? The traceability of calibration, I think, is important and something that we could centralize. Like, why have all of us do it separately? But yeah, so if we could have the Canadian standard that we can trace back, then that would be very helpful, very handy. Just as an aside, vendors are not always quick to adapt to new international standards. So I think if we wait for our vendors to make changes to their assays in response to new standards, you might be waiting 40 years, which is the case for ferritin right now. We're on our 4th international standard for ferritin, and 2 of the main assays are still on the 1st standard. So that's fun. They don't match at all.
So I have a final question, then we're going to open the floor for questions. This was raised by several of you. Given that our goal is to come together as a single HEMANET infrastructure, what kind of special considerations should we devote to creating an HQP training program for individuals that would be able to train in a centralized program and be able to work in whatever HEMANET laboratories across the nation? Is there value in doing such a thing? Is this feasible? Is this a good idea?
So I'm not sure how long it might take to create a dedicated training program. I mean, I don't think that it's a bad idea, but you know, having a dedicated training program just for a relatively narrow, you know, discipline might not be in the best interest of somebody who goes through the program, you know, like in terms of sort of the value they get for their time. But I think it will be really crucial to make sure that existing training programs for, you know, undergrads, for techs, for, you know, like other kind of programs that end up supplying people who work in the labs, that those programs have modules incorporated into them that address serology and considerations of serosurveillance, you know, those kind of things.
Carmen, do you have any thoughts on whether your laboratory would benefit from a training program or having trainees enter with certain skill sets, whether it's data analysis, modeling, or simply technical abilities to work on different assays?
Yeah, so I alluded it a little bit in the first session this morning that I felt like our public health master's students could have a little bit more infectious disease training, but I do think that cross-training among different groups would also be beneficial. And I don't know if that is really, as I say it, I'm not sure if it's really feasible because it would be such a niche program. I feel like what we were really missing is just people. We were willing to train them and get them going, but to try to hire someone in that time was nearly impossible. So it's almost not even a training question, but an actual physical person question.
All right.
I was thinking for our location, what might be most valuable would be to try to leverage some strategic partnerships. So, I mean, we have graduate students in other areas who could potentially, you know, be tapped on the shoulder to take on this sort of project. And, you know, instead of saying, well, we're going to have a dedicated training program for this, it's like, well, no, I'm going to partner with this other PI and co-lead, you know, this particular graduate student's project so that they can apply what they're already doing in, whether it's data or something else, to my HEMANET data set, my HEMANET problem. So.
All right. We're going to open the floor for questions. Again, focusing on how are we going to build this national network of laboratories to support HEMANET?
This one, thanks, Marc-André, and thanks everyone.
There's an online question. Angela, we'll just start with a...
Sorry. Dr. Deb Money has a question. So, Dr. Money, you can go ahead.
I just feel like there's a common theme coming up over and over again, which the lab leads have highlighted here, that nationwide capabilities are dependent on this ability to share samples and to share data. And my question is, this has been said over and over and over again, how are we actually going to get there to have either pre-standardized agreements or templates so that we don't sort of end up replicating these barriers over and over again?
Anyone want to tackle that question?
A FAC SLTO program.
DLTO, data liaison.
Oh yeah, one of those too. Yeah.
I mean, I'm not sure what can be done at a federal level, but I guess we can at least start at the provincial level to maybe design some more standardized MTAs to be able to, transfer between provincial lab to research labs, for example. And kind of we've been trying to do a little bit of that, but very slowly because we don't have dedicated personnel to work on that specifically. But I think it can start at the provincial level to try and sort of solve the problem locally, and then see if we can join forces more globally.
I think what Carmen mentioned earlier too is just it has to be done at a very high level. Otherwise, these agreements disappear with the changing of government or institutions or leads or whatnot. So.
At a regional level, I'm hoping for Atlantic Canada that I can leverage some of the political things that are happening anyways, where physicians are able to move between Atlantic provinces seamlessly now. So it's like, well, if physicians can move between Atlantic provinces, why can't samples?
Angela?
So just a very quick comment on the training bit is I think we've identified it frequently enough to know that there is a need for a training program, but like we have other countries that contact our biobank who have masters in biobanking programs and they want to intern in Canada. We don't have that degree program. The University of Toronto has had the same, they've had at least 3 candidates contact them. We have one coming from Lyon, and he's actually from the Democratic Republic of Congo, who has biobanking experience of going in the field for malaria specimens and so on. Like there is a need to do biobanking well, and on a level of where you get a certificate, like an actual degree for it. So I think it goes beyond like learning how to do an ELISA. There's the art of biobanking needs to be acknowledged as being absent in Canada on a national level. So maybe speak to the universities and coordinate a national biobanking master's degree at multiple sites so that the students can intern at these different sites. That's a program for training that you could then feed into this whole system.
Thanks. Steve?
Yeah, I think the problem with acquiring material is that when your seroprevalence rate's 1% and you don't have a lot of PCR tests out there, how do you get positives? I think from the lab group, before we merged with immunology, Mel was really big on, can we get large volumes of blood from positives? And we did try that with Robin Lindsay and taking some plasma from convalescent plasma we weren't going to use. That was serology positive, and at least trial running it through the system. And it took forever. Like it took forever to get the MTAs, took forever to move it around. But I think from a blood operator's perspective, if you can get the 450 mil volume or larger of plasma, then having a common positive is not a problem. Looking at what's in the plasma and whether it's compatible with your assay and whether you want to build an assay based on plasma is another question, though. The question about standardization, you weren't really clear. Are we talking standard neutralization at print 50? Are we talking standard of virus-like particles? Are we talking spike in a semi-quantitative assay, which is not truly quantitative? Or do you want to standardize your nucleocapsid? Because That's an issue. Or do you want to talk about standards where you're bumping around a limited detection doing a probe regression? Because I'm still not sure what a standardized or N is going to tell you, NTN is going to tell you. And I'm not sure in some cases what a standard anti-S is going to tell you, because those will vary in terms of neutralizing capacity based on what your variant is. So those are things, and also, you know, I have people coming to me saying, WHO doesn't have more standards. Can you give me some standards? I don't have any standards, man. I can tell you what the Print 50 is, but that's not standard enough. And people trying to scatter around and try to do that, but very, very hard to do. So I think we have to be very clear, like, why are people asking for those results? And is it really going to change how you interpret the results or practice?
Thanks. Kate?
Yes, I'm sort of horrified by it. We've been laughing about this, but I mean, this is crazy. And I'm wondering, we really need to pull the lessons learned that we've been hearing about today and contact the missing people to get the other pieces to put in here. We're not prepared going forward. We're not at all. So I think we really need to take this quite seriously. My question was not about the lab itself, but about the data sharing. So we saw Agatha had her slide about the email from Bonnie. Derek, what kind of agreement did you make, and how did you get access to the vaccine registry? And can you get that in writing? And then what do the other labs need to do to broker that kind of arrangement? Because right now we don't have that kind of data sharing.
Yeah, well, I can tell you what I did.
Sold your soul, didn't you?
Do we need to stop recording?
We might have. I was just thinking that, actually. Well, we did have so there was in Manitoba, there was a vaccine task force very early on. The task force was using, they were already doing regular data extracts from our provincial vaccine registry system to look at where uptake was happening and in what groups and whatnot. So there was a whole group within public health that was already looking and running those analyses. And I just said, you know, we have a provincial seroprevalence program. We would love to connect that data with the vaccine data. Here's my list of, and this happens because CADM in particular, up until very, very recently, was part of the government system. So public health and CADM were essentially the same thing. So I was able to just send them a list of all the FINs and said, hey, can you send me back the registry? And 10 minutes later, I got it. It was quite straightforward. Now CADM is actually under an incorporated entity called Shared Health within Manitoba now. And so I'm not really sure that could actually even happen anymore, because we're not actually part of public health anymore per se. So that's what I did, and it worked out well. And I was feeding that data back to the vaccine task force as well, because then they were able to look at, you know, immunity trends as well. Yeah. No, it's on my list.
Final.
A lot of my experience was, I'm going to keep going until someone tells me no.
Well, that's actually what I meant.
And having gone
I just
through
didn't
that,
say it out loud.
One final question, Dr. Pinto, please.
oh, sorry, I was just going to say, having gone through that same merger, you know, in the before times, Ripple was a part of the ministry, and we had that open line of communication with public health and could have that data sharing. And then as soon as we flipped into the Sask Health Authority, it was just like a steel wall. It's been very difficult.
I have a couple of comments based on my experience. So for the national standards, what we call the secondary standards in the WHO language, there is a manual that was prepared with guidance, and I can send that link if you cannot find it. Sometimes it's difficult to navigate all these documents. And we just had a workshop in Indonesia to implement this manual with about 40 different countries, representatives from different countries across the globe. And again, my suggestion, and that's what we did, because we didn't have access to a WHO international standard. We wanted to standardize. It's so powerful when you standardize across this network. We could just get the data in those binding or arbitrary units. And then when it got available, you calibrate it, like exactly what you were saying. And then keep doing calibrations and checking the traceability over time, because you can get these weird things happen. And so, yeah, as was discussed. And then the other aspect is in terms of supply chain and conversations. It's very important to have conversations with the commercial vendors, not at the sales level, but leadership level. We had, with several of the commercial vendors, we had periodic calls just to, because they need to anticipate. Sometimes they did not know what was going to be the needs. And again, conversations about standards. Many of them were very open to standardization and to utilize them, and even asking samples. So again, those communications, I think are going to be critical for this emergency. So you actually have what you need, because they are able to produce the lots based on your expected demands. Yeah. So.
All right, thank you. We're going to conclude the session now.
Sorry,
Yep.
there was just a comment from Dr. Jasmine. So, Dr. Jasmine, you can go ahead.
Oh, I don't want to keep you. I don't know if you can hear me, but I just, I'm glad that you remember that I put up that slide that I said I got to email Bonnie. And so the intention is to be provocative sometimes so that people remember that there are these pathways. But the theme of us talking and continuing to talk is critical, because as you can see the disconnect. It's the questions are, how did you do it as a province? How did you do it? But what I ask my colleagues in other provinces is I call them and I say, how did you do it? Because if someone tells me they had an easier path, I will bring that to my province and say, listen, Ontario is able to do it this way. And then my province might say, oh, maybe we should do that. And we can use each other as arguments and justifications. So having the venues to talk is critical. Thank you.
Yeah.
No, so I'm gonna ask Dad.
Agatha, after you put up that slide, I actually texted my boss and I was like, Agatha got to do this and got this stuff right away. Why can't I do that?
All right, I'd like to thank the panelists for a wonderful discussion.